So back with 5.5, we're in the second video, and we are in example 6. Everything is done the exact same way we have been doing it. We're just adding little tweaks here of struggles you might run into, so it's learning how to do these. So again, we are first of all simplifying. Top is done. The y squared, we're going to factor out a y. Difference of two squares, if you remember that, y plus 5, y minus 5. Okay, so we're simplified. So we just need to look and see what our common denominator is. We have a y here. We have a y minus 5 here. We also have one there, but we only need one. And we have a y plus 5 here. So these three are our common denominators. So let's put that here. Okay, so we have to multiply that by each term. That equals, and again, I know this gets to be long and drawn out. There we go. Now let's cancel. Cancel both of those. I know I'm going to be able to cancel those. And both of those with both of those. And I end up with y plus 5. And this is where it becomes important to be neat, because then you know what you've canceled out and what you have not canceled out. Okay. All right, so now we're going to multiply those together using FOIL. Okay, and that equals 2y. So let's set that equal to 0. I'm going to subtract 2y here, subtract 2y here, so we have a minus y minus 20 equals 0. And again, break that down into two binomials. So we have a y minus 5 and a y plus 4. So my y equals 5 and negative 4 there, or negative 4. So you substitute these two numbers into the original equation, which is way up here. And you got to make sure it's the original one. And you will find out that negative 4 works, but 5 does not work. So 5 goes away for being an extraneous solution, and our only answer is negative 4. All right, jump up to example 7. Okay, this is the same as x over 1. So it makes it real easy to come up with common denominator. So we're going to multiply y minus 2 times the x and the y minus 2 times the y minus 4 over y minus 2. And this cancels. Nothing cancels over here because it just had a 1 in the denominator. So let's distribute the 2. And we just have a y minus 4 left here. So let's go ahead and solve. Okay, the instructions just say solve for y. So we're not really going to get a number. We just have to get all of the y's together, and then we'll be in a place where we can do what we need to do. So I'm going to bring this y over here. So subtract y from there and there. Okay. Now I'm going to send this 2x over here. So I have xy minus y equals 2x minus 4. And then I can see here that I have some y's together, so I'm going to factor out a y. And remember, when I bring this y out, I've always got a 1 there. Okay, now I can divide both sides by x minus 1. And that cancels this one and this one, and that leaves me with y equals 2x minus 4 over x minus 1. All right, let's keep cruising along here. So example 8, we have 1 over x equals 1 over b plus 1 over a, and they're asking us to solve for x. So again, we're not looking for a solution, we're just solving for x. So first of all, we have fractions, so let's get rid of the fractions. My common denominator are a, b, and x. So I'm going to put that. So again, all I'm doing is trying to get rid of the fractions. So I end up with AB equals AX plus BX. So again, I'm trying to isolate the X. I'm trying to find X. So I've got that. I'm going to factor out common X's. And then I divide both sides by a plus b, because that whole parenthesis is being multiplied by the x, so I can divide both sides. And this cancels with that, and I've got x equals ab over a plus b. Okay, so the last section on this is graphing rational equations. We'll spend just a minute on that and be done. All right, so there's a couple things when you're graphing this. First of all, we want to find out where this graph crosses the y-axis, if it does. So in order to find that out, we need to make x 0. So when I do that, I end up getting f of x equals -3. So that ends up being where it crosses the y-axis. Remember, you put a 0 in for the x, and that will tell you where it crosses the y. So I know it crosses there. And I also know that if I put 2 in here, that would make this undefined. So that being the case, let me draw a line. I'm just going to make it a dotted line. And what that means is that this graph, it's going to be really funky, is not going to cross that blue dotted line. And that's one thing I like to do, is put a 0, or find out what's going to make this undefined and draw a vertical line there. Okay, so that means x cannot be 2 because it would make it undefined. So that means that graph, if it's going to come to around here, it might come close to this line, but it won't touch it. And that's important to know. And then all we do, really, to graph these at this point, in later lessons, we'll get into some other ways to graph this. You just start putting numbers in here. So maybe you want to put in -4, and you find out that this is -1. So that point is -4, -1. Let's put in 1. Put in 1 and we get a -6. Okay, and let's put in a 0 for y. We put in a 0 for x to find out where it crossed the x line, or the y line right here. Let's put a 0 in for y and find out where it crosses the x line. If we do that, we get 0 for our y, because remember, that's what f of x is. Okay, what number can we put in here so that when we take 6 divided by this, we get 0? Nothing. There is nothing, because if we get a 0 here, it's undefined. It's not 0. There's no number. So we also know it doesn't cross the x-axis. So that means I get a graph that looks like this. It doesn't cross either one of those lines. Now, I'm not done yet. I haven't tried any numbers on this side of that blue line. It's important to look at numbers on both sides of that line. So I put in a 3 and I get a 6. I put in a 4, I get a 3. And I put in a 5, and I get a 2. And one of the things that you need to remember is if it doesn't cross the x-axis here, it doesn't cross over here either. So then I can kind of just draw my graph that looks like that. And that's what a graph will look like. Now remember, we talked about linear equations, and those were equations where the exponent on the x was 1, and that gave us a straight line. A linear equation is a straight line. The problem is when we start putting that x in the denominator, that's when it quits becoming a linear equation. The other ones, when we had things like x plus 4 equals y, that was a linear equation because the x was in the numerator. Once we put that x in the denominator, it makes things pretty goofy, just kind of like this one. So again, just real quickly, we don't go into a lot of detail on this, is get the equation, find out what happens if you put 0 in for x and 0 in for y, and it will tell you if you cross the x and the y axis and where. And then also find out if there is a variable in the denominator. Find out what's going to make that undefined. And if it's an x, which it usually will be, it's going to be a vertical line going through that number that makes this undefined or 0. So it was a 2. And that tells you that your graph isn't going to cross that line. But you need to, when you make this XY table, that you use numbers on the left and right of the blue dotted line to make sure you see that there's a graph here, and you also see what happens to the graph here, because 99% of the time there will be a graph on both sides of that line. So if we look real quickly at example 10, see if we can erase all this just to give you one more bit of practice and then we'll be done. So we have g of x, which is the same as f of x, which is the same as y. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, what's going to make that 0? A -2 is going to make that 0. So let's go ahead and draw that line. Okay, quick and easy. Then we find out what happens if my x is 0. And that gives me 3. So I know it crosses the y-axis at 3. Okay, next question is, what happens if I make my y 0? Is there any number I can add to 2 so that I take 6 divided by that and get 0? No, there's not. So I know then that my graph does not cross the x-axis, which it usually won't. And then I'm going to make my table. Don't really have much information yet. All right, so let's put -1 in here, and I find out my y is 6. And I'm going to put 1 in here, and I get a 2. And I'm going to put a 4 in, and I get a 1. Okay, so it gets closer and closer to that x-axis, but it will never cross it. It will go into infinity without ever crossing it. Now let's look over at this side of the line. Put in a -5, it gives me a -2. put in a -3, then I get a -6. Okay, and really once I have that and I know what this graph looks like here, it's pretty much easy to draw this graph because I know it's not going to cross the x-axis or the blue line, and I can just kind of make a copy of it over on that side. And that's it for 5.5.